VTR V81/13652, The Making of 81, Part 1, edited master, transmission date 1st of January 82.
Good evening. It's been a year in which the news, perhaps even more than usual, touched our emotions or our lives. A takeover in Poland, 3 world leaders shot, Sadat killed. Once unthinkable violence on the streets of English cities. We all battled against recession and high unemployment. Politicians tried to sort out those problems and each other. The news that made you pleased or made you smile might have seemed tucked away on occasions, but we have that too tonight. And first, a flavour of the year we've just left.
The planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
Just delighted and unhappy.
Next to it, Charles and I can't go wrong. He's there with me.
Welcome back.
Here we are. Thanks be to God.
We think that this country has suffered too much from manifesto-itis.
We have ignition of the solid rocket boosters and liftoff. Liftoff of America's space shuttle.
Retreat? Hell no! We only just got here.
I pronounce that they be man and wife together.
It is not a conflict between individuals.
I'm a peaceman, an inveterate, incurable peacemonger.
The most cold, callous, brutal thing. Subhuman.
We're not only on our way, but we're very likely to form the next government of Great Britain.
If the year ended in Poland with freedom lost, it began with freedom gained for the American hostages. We recall their homecoming in a moment, but first we review Poland's troubled year and its frightening finale.
Months of crisis had seen the Polish economy go from bad to worse, with food queues almost everywhere. Many goods were rationed, and the annual inflation rate ran into 3 figures. The national debt climbed to £15 billion, much of it to Western banks. The year began with Lech Wałęsa travelling to Rome to meet the Pope, Polish himself under great influence on the Catholic Poles. And over the next 12 months, Solidarity staged not 1 but 2 national strikes, the first ever in the communist bloc. but continual confrontation led to fears of a Soviet invasion. So far that hasn't happened, but in the months that led up to the military takeover, manoeuvres were used time and again to warn or intimidate Solidarity's leaders. On the whole, Lech Wałęsa wasn't easily frightened, but when the government threatened anti-strike legislation, the union moved to end a spate of local strikes. The growing conflict forced out Stanisław Kania, who was replaced as Communist Party leader by General Jaruzelski. In early December, riot police stormed the Warsaw Fire School to evict strikers. But Solidarity remained defiant. The very next day, at a large meeting that was closed to the authorities, the union leadership decided to seek popular support for free elections. It was the last straw. General Jaruzelski had the meeting bugged, and it gave him the ammunition he needed. When the takeover came, it was swift and efficient. Solidarity's leaders were arrested en masse, including Lech Wałęsa. Communications were cut, both within Poland and to the outside world. Thousands of people were interned, the borders were closed, and a curfew was imposed. The army was in command. There would be no more humiliating concessions to Solidarity. The union was suspended indefinitely. Even on Polish television, the newsreaders now wore military uniforms. The Polish authorities said things were returning to normal, but reports of strikes and sit-ins continued. In church, the Poles offered prayers for those who died. In Washington, the Polish ambassador defected, but the West could offer little more than economic sanctions and tough words.
They have been betrayed by their own government. The men who rule them and their totalitarian allies fear the very freedom that the Polish people cherish.
From the White House, President Reagan urged Americans to light a candle in solidarity with the Polish people. In Rome, Pope John Paul did the same. In St. Peter's Square and throughout the West, Solidarity sympathizers demonstrated their support. The union's influence with the Polish people had grown to the point where the country's rulers needed to act. Solidarity was more than just a trade union. It was a threatening beacon of light in a crusade for workers' self-determination. At midnight on December the 12th, General Jaruzelski extinguished that threat.
So, light a candle for Poland was the Reagan message on Christmas Eve. But the symbols at the start of his presidency were yellow ribbons, thousands of them, as 52 American hostages held in Iran for 444 days came home at last.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will...
It was the most remarkable inauguration of an American president in history, with the nation's attention divided between hailing their new chief and the imminent release of the hostages. Jimmy Carter left office that day a devastated man. The hostage crisis had haunted his presidency. He'd suffered a humiliating election defeat, and the Iranians tormented him to the last, refusing to release their captives until he'd left for political obscurity in Plains, Georgia. In Tehran, the hostages were finally allowed on board their plane. Freedom was only minutes away. And in Washington, at a post-inauguration ball, President Reagan was at last able to tell a breathless nation that they really were on their way home.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
Americans had their first glimpse of the freed hostages when they landed in Algiers. For their families watching on television at home, it was almost too much to bear. And all across the nation, Americans celebrated. The hostages came to Washington for family reunions, and the nation's capital, normally a rather reserved city, gave the hostages an unprecedented display of affection.
The President of the United States and the 53 freed Americans.
Bruce Langan spoke for the hostages.
It is good to be back. Thank you, America. And God bless all of you.
Three Britons were released from Iran later. Another, Andrew Pike, remains in an ordeal that still leaves its mark on many of the freed American hostages. In March, America's president became the first of 3 world leaders to be shot. President Sadat was killed, remarkably each time the cameras were there. It was Ronald Reagan's 70th day as president. The gunman was quickly pinned to the wall. But a Secret Service bodyguard and a uniformed policeman had been hit. Press Secretary Jim Brady had a bullet in his brain, while another ricocheted to hit the president, missing his heart by 3 inches. In all, 6 shots in 2 seconds. Security men and police hustled away John Hinckley Jr., 25-year-old son of an oil executive, a drifter whose obsession with a young Hollywood actress drove him to try to copy here the macabre plot of a film in which he'd starred. For the 70-year-old president, a 3-hour operation and a remarkable recovery saw him out of hospital 12 days later, while America reflected on its gun-toting society and the advances in medical skills without which the president would have died.
I have recovered. I feel fine. And the doctors say I've recovered. So if I'm a medical miracle, I'm a happy one.
St. Peter's Square in Rome. Pope John Paul II was doing what he loved best, seeing and being seen by the thousands who flocked to his regular Wednesday audience. 10 feet away, a Browning pistol was raised, at least 4 shots fired. A finger on the Pope's left hand was shattered. A second bullet tore through his intestines. While onlookers wept, police captured the attacker, a Turk, Mehmet Ali Agca, so dangerous that Turkish police had orders to shoot him on sight. Throughout the world, in the hours and days that followed, 700 million Catholics were to hold special masses for the gentle man who had led them for 2.5 years. And nowhere were the worry and the prayers more fervent than in his native Poland. It was 5 months before the Pope was to return to the place where he was shot. For him, a bulletproof vest. For his followers, body searches and metal detectors, and a wondering if it would ever be quite the same again. In Cairo, President Sadat reviewed a military parade commemorating a wartime success against the Israelis. But it was the peace with that nation, written into the Camp David Accord, that preoccupied his thoughts. 6 Mirage jets entertained and distracted the president and his guests. So few saw the truck stop in front of them or the 4 soldiers jump out. For 50 seconds, the gunmen, all Muslim extremists, fired shots into the stand, some at point-blank range. The president was to die 2 hours later from terrible injuries. Aerobatics continued, the pilots unaware of the carnage below. Fellow architects of the Camp David Agreement and other world leaders were to come to his funeral in force, as President Reagan promised that the cause for which this good and brave man stood would endure and triumph. Earlier in the year, the sound of gunfire in the Mall as the Queen rode to Trooping the Colour. The 6 shots were blanks. 17-year-old Marcus Sargent, unemployed, did it to try and make himself famous. At his trial, the judge said, "I've little doubt that if you'd had a real gun, you'd have tried to murder Her Majesty." It was a year that brought home the frightening vulnerability of the world's leaders. And in the spring, parts of England's cities proved vulnerable too to a kind of violence that few expected.
Brixton. Urban decay, tension between police and young blacks, that was well known. What had never been seen before was the unbridled hostility aimed at the police.
George, you keep out of here. They see the police as their target.
July, this time Liverpool. For 10 days it seemed every city in England was about to explode. Liverpool, Leeds, Leicester, London, and Moss Side, Manchester.
That's 40 years' work and I'm soaked.
What kind of shop was it? It's a clothing store.
For the first time on the mainland, petrol bombs. Those involved said its roots lay in deprivation, be it slum housing or unemployment or both. The police saw the controlling hand of extremists. Both sides could agree that authority had never been challenged like this before. There were copycat riots, looting reminiscent of America in the 60s. Looting now in Toxteth, Birmingham, Wood Green. In April, the police had been armed with anything they could find. Come the summer, they had crash helmets, visors, riot shields. And CS gas if police chiefs like Kenneth Oxford in Liverpool felt it necessary. And he did, to the dismay of many local people.
These are military tactics. Mr. Oxford's idea of an army of occupation. I mean, what's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen the day after? Is this the answer?
Mrs. Thatcher's answer was blunt. Law and order had to be the main priority.
Protection of the police must come first, because without that there can be no law, there can be no society. But there is no future for any society unless the laws are upheld totally impartially. The law has no colour.
Lord Scarman's inquiry did see racial disadvantage threatening the very survival of our society. His call for major changes in policing was expected. Missing, according to many black leaders, was a call for a strong government attack on the problems. Nevertheless, some, like Michael Heseltine, did come, look and leave converted to the need for one nation, which would not take action against rioters so much as the conditions which spawned them. At the end of the year, Lord Scarman was to leave us with the same conclusion that President Johnson reached in America in the late 60s, that we must attack the conditions that breed despair and violence, not because we're frightened of conflict, but because we're fired by conscience.
On the economic front, Britain kept taking its monetarist medicine, and the government, halfway through its term of office, found its policies under increasing attack.
Mrs. Thatcher needed an egg catcher. It was a year of unemployment and factory closures and workers' usually ineffectual protests. The new employment secretary replied.
I grew up in the 30s with an unemployed father. He didn't riot. He got on his bike and looked for work, and he kept looking till he found it.
But unemployment grew steadily up from 2.5 million and then hovered unsteadily just under 3 million, helped by taking old people permanently and young people temporarily off the register. Some of the young came to London to see the Prime Minister at the House of Commons.
She presented us with the same excuses, the same story. She avoided the real issues.
It was worth bringing our point across, but I don't know whether she's got any feelings for us, whether she understands how we feel.
In the northeast, school leavers advertised themselves and their talents on television.
My name is Dawn Close. I am a 16-year-old school leaver, and I am looking for a job as an apprentice hairdresser.
If anybody would like to employ me, I do my best to fulfill the requirements asked of me.
The pound descended from $2.40, where exporters cried it was ruining them, to $1.90. Interest rates rose to stop it falling further, so mortgages went up too, to 15%. And the stock market rose to 560 and then tumbled down, as if it had just heard of the awful word, slump. The Prime Minister reshuffled Mr. Pryor and made her cabinet drier. And she had a slogan.
Retreat? Hell no! We only just got here.
There were Tory critics, and one of them was allowed to speak to the party conference.
What then are the consequences of the present situation, and one which is going to deteriorate? It is that our young people, of course, will move further and further into revolt. But let us not forget those who, at the age of early 50, find that they are redundant on the market and can see that never again are they going to have an opportunity of a job.
But the Prime Minister waltzed away, even with the latest critic she'd fired from her cabinet, Sir Ian Gilmore. She'd go on to the end of the road.
The tough measures that this government has had to introduce are the very minimum needed for us to win through. I will not change just to court popularity.
She could see strikes for more pay beaten, some at British Leyland. Airline staff chose to take actual pay cuts to keep their jobs.
Well, it has to be thought about. It has to be thought about, but if it's going to save Pan Am, we'll do it.
You'd do it?
I would do it, yeah.
Would it affect your standard of living very much?
Well, not very much, but it would affect it, naturally.
So you'd rather do it than lose a job?
Certainly, without a doubt.
Okay.
But the miners said they'd come out on top whatever happened, and to make sure they voted Mr. Arthur Scargill their president.
Okay.
And inflation did come down, from 13% to 12%, though actually above where it was when Mrs. Thatcher came to power. And Britain ran a trade surplus of £700 million with Europe. Part of it was oil, but manufacturers had done well too. The EEC's two big contributors, Britain and Germany, tried to get together to cut their share. But the alliance didn't impress the French. President and Prime Minister still shared a hope, though he didn't help her by keeping interest rates up. But when he spoke, he always spoke like her.
This government must stiffen its spine and not throw in the towel on our fight to get federal spending under control. I am determined to stick with it, stay on course, and I will not be deterred by temporary economic changes or short-term political expediency.
Still, the idea was out and running that the monetarists might be chasing their own tail, that cuts in employment just put up public spending on the unemployed. And if America weren't thriving, how could Britain thrive? The Chancellor kept on putting up taxes in his November statement and kept on putting up people's backs.
Output is expected to rise by about 1%, and manufacturing output rather more rapidly. The outlook, in short, is for gradual recovery.
Could Mrs. Thatcher count on even a gradual recovery with the voters in 1982? She thought so.
Mrs. Thatcher's determination was on trial too over Northern Ireland. Despite a wish for peace among many, it was the year of the hunger strike, more violence, a seeming polarisation of the two communities, even talk of making Ulster ungovernable. An IRA funeral tribute for one of the 10 hunger strikers who died in a bid to wring out of the government political status for those held in the H blocks of the Maze prison. It showed the continuing depth of the Ulster divide when hunger striker Bobby Sands was elected MP for Fermanagh.
And I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected to serve as a member for the third constituency.
But after 66 days, Sands was dead, and the world's media joined the thousands of mourners at his funeral. It was perhaps the IRA's biggest propaganda coup. Predictably, Sands' death raised the level of violence on the streets of Ulster, as angry IRA sympathisers fought security forces. World opinion was now strongly against Britain. In the United States, where TV screens were filled nightly with scenes like these, demonstrators gave Prince Charles a bad time and later forced Princess Margaret to cancel a visit to Washington. and the IRA found money and recruits flowing its way again. Some 100 soldiers, police and civilians were murdered in a land where bereavement and grief on all sides have become a part of everyday life. The Prime Minister remained determined not to give in.
Because the political status sought by the hunger strikers will not be granted.
The hunger strike supporters tried to storm the British Embassy in Dublin, but got little sympathy from the Irish police. The Dublin government realised that the IRA posed a threat south of the border too. The support in the north stayed solid. Bobby Sands' agent, Owen Carron, was voted in to replace him as Fermannah's MP. But after 216 days, the battle of wills finally went Mrs. Thatcher's way. Helped by pressure from relatives, the hunger strike collapsed, but the IRA returned to London. 2 died in a nail bomb attack outside Chelsea Barracks. The Commandant General of the Royal Marines lost part of a leg when a bomb exploded under his car. Another bomb in an Oxford Street Wimpy bar killed bomb disposal veteran Kenneth Howarth. Mrs. Thatcher and the new Irish Premier Dr. Fitzgerald continued the talks between London and Dublin and agreed to form a new Anglo-Irish Council. Ian Paisley condemned that as one step towards a united Ireland. When one of his fellow MPs, the Reverend Robert Bradford, was murdered by the IRA, he threatened to make Ulster ungovernable. The new Ulster Secretary, Jim Pryor, was hissed at the funeral service and hustled into his car afterwards to escape the wrath of an angry mob. A loyalist day of action followed. Mr. Paisley called for a third force. At year's end, the public face of Ulster showed Protestants backing their hardliners just as much as the Republicans backed theirs.
No surrender! God save the Queen! Ulster forever!
There was at least one day when the violence and the hatred seemed to stop. July the 29th. That's coming next. Welcome home, Columbia, the shuttle that went back for more. Plus a look at Her Majesty's opposition, all of them, a roundup of foreign news, the capture of the Yorkshire Ripper, and some great sporting moments to remember. That's all after the break.